Here are the three elements of my compact panoramic gimbal. What I need to do is assemble this to get it ready, and I'm going to use my tripod to get it all set up, but I'm actually going to be swapping out the tripod for a clamp and putting it in a slightly more precarious situation where I can get the whole panoramic view of the city itself. But the first thing I need to do is go ahead and assemble this and make sure it's ready, all put together and secured, because when I put it on the edge, I want to make sure everything is perfectly correct. So the first thing here is just going to assemble it a little bit. This is very basic. This is just like any other Pano gimbal, but it's much smaller. It's made for mirrorless cameras. You can probably shoot with a full-size Nikon or Canon, but it's really made for a compact mirrorless camera. So for now, I'm just going to clip this in to the top of my tripod here, just so that I can get it ready to go here. On my camera itself, you guys can see that, there is a little indication on my grip. Any L plate or any professional plate you guys buy should have an indication of the dead center point. So the first thing I want to do is make sure that that dead center point lines up with my center point here. And I'm just going to tighten that down all the way and obviously make sure that there's no wiggle room. Most important thing with this, to get the center of rotation, I'm going to turn on the camera and I'm going to look through the live view mode, and I'm just going to make sure that this is basically in the center. So that's the center point there. You can see it on my focus point right in the center. I'm just going to make sure that that is pretty much dead center. The reason being is that's going to become my center of rotation. I kind of lock this down just a little bit like that. One thing I want to point out is right now I've centered this area so that my center point of the camera is going to face this. So when I rotate it, it's going to rotate right in the center. The correct way to do this is to actually calculate, using the nodal slide, the correct nodal point for zero parallax on your camera. Now, I'm not going to do that here because I'm shooting an infinite cityscape. Shooting an infinite cityscape means there's actually no parallax. Parallax occurs when we move back and forth and we have objects that are both close and far in distance. And as you rotate the camera, if you don't calculate the zero parallax point, just like you turn your head, objects move at different speed. So if you're going to stitch multiple panels together and objects are moving at a different speed, then from panel to panel, they don't actually line up. Now, since there's an infinite cityscape that we're shooting, when you move side to side, nothing's going to happen. When you turn your head, it basically looks like a flat plane. So as long as this is close enough, it's not going to matter. Everything is going to stitch properly. Just as a rule of thumb, and I know I've already gone through how to calculate the zero parallax point with you guys. Good thing if you don't have time to do it in the field, if you're setting up, you basically want to say that the center of rotation is somewhere around the bulb of the lens. What's interesting about this lens, since it's the 10 to 24, is that does move a little bit. So if you want the exact point, you're going to have to calculate each increment. But if I know that I'm going to be shooting somewhere between 10 and 14 millimeter in APS-C, I know that I need my center of rotation to be right around there at that point on the bulb itself. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is attach this in very carefully. And remember, I'm just testing it on the tripod here. And as I rotate this down here to about 90 degrees, you can see that as I start to rotate this, it's not level yet. You can see that it rotates right around that center point pivot, and the front of the lens, slide it back even a little bit more to make sure that the element, that front element of the lens, also becomes the closest thing to the point of rotation. So now we can see that this point basically stays static as the camera rotates for the pano. So the reason I'm doing this on the tripod is I'm about to convert this into a clamp setup. The situation of where I'm setting up this clamp is a little bit tricky and a little bit technical, so it's easier to get everything set up on the ground. That way it's all correct, nothing's wrong, nothing's loose obviously, and when we're dealing with being on the 80-something floor, or the roof of a building, we want to make sure that everything's locked down and there's no chance at all that anything could fall. An important thing to point out is I actually don't need a pano rig like this to get a panoramic image. I could probably just use my ball head and twist it from side to side because there's no parallax in the scene. But the very specific thing that this allows me to do is make sure that I have a consistent level. So I have an extra little leveling base right here, and I can actually change this as I twist it. We'll go over this a little bit more when I actually get into position, but I can assure here, if everything's level, as I rotate this, this stays level. Now what that'll mean is if I have a level horizon on this extent, on the right side of the frame, and I move all the way over to the left, that level will stay the same and my horizon will be perfect. So using this Pano gimbal, even if you do not have to calibrate the zero parallax point, will still give you the ability to stitch higher quality and more accurate panos in the end. The next step is I'm going to be losing the tripod here and the ball head, and I'm going to be attaching this directly to this stud right here on top of the clamp. The first thing I need to do is find a good place to clamp this, and I'm going to do it without the camera attached. So I'm going to take this rig and I'm actually going to find a place to clamp it to the corner of that wall right over there. This is a really interesting setup. There's a few areas that I could clamp. There's this here. It's a little wide. This bar is a little bit wider. There's a few things that I could probably clamp sideways, but it looks like this open metal beam here, this square beam, might work out the best. It's very important when you're dealing with height in general to triple check everything. This is 100% secure. This is 100% secure. This is 100% secure. That's why I set it up on the tripod. Now what I have to do is I have to attach this camera to this plate. Again, lining up that center point. Now, before I let go of this camera, I want to make sure that it's perfectly stable. And it looks pretty good right now. So that's dead center. Now let's just go ahead and make some small adjustments before I talk about the settings themselves. Now, I had this leveled out before I brought the camera up here, but the camera adds quite a bit of weight to the gimbal itself and a little bit of instability, even though, to be honest, this is actually pretty rock solid considering we're using a clamp on the corner of an 80th floor rooftop. What I want to do here is level this out very carefully. So I'm just going to twist that and try to get that ball dead center there. And as soon as it floats right into target, I'm just going to lock it down. Now, as soon as you let go, it will generate a little bit of sag because remember, we're actually manipulating this, but I want it to be as close to center as possible. And right there is actually pretty good. As I start to rotate it, you can see that that center will stay pretty much the same. And that's really nice. So here's pretty much the extent of my pano on this side. When I leveled it, I actually leveled it basically in the center. The thought being if it starts to go off level on either side, if we leveled it in the center, it'll be a good reading. So even here, barely off, as long as it stays inside of that black circle, even if it's just off just a hair, it's going to be okay. So this is going to be the extent of my pano this way. Still looks pretty level. Dead center, perfectly level. Extent of pano again, almost level too. So we have a nice system for sliding back and forth. So for you guys watching this, this may seem like a really weird shooting location, but to be honest, we encounter this all over Dubai. In fact, this is the rooftop of a building. And if you look at a lot of these rooftops in Dubai, they're beautiful. There's all these designs, there's this crazy architecture, but they were never made to be enjoyed as viewing spots. There's no balcony with a railing and a viewing terrace. There's just construction. Like there's metal beams, there's stuff to clean the windows, there's satellite dishes, there's exposed wires. It's actually quite dangerous. So even if we consider like we can actually get up here, and a lot of the times you can't get on the roof, it's impossible to set up tripods. Like there's nowhere to set up a tripod. So I'm actually setting up a clamp in the corner, and I know a lot of you guys probably wouldn't want to do something like that, but that clamp is rock solid and actually gives me the best perspective. So here in Dubai, we're always having to do crazy stuff with our tripods or clamps or anything like that. The last step I need to do is actually tether that. So we're going to take a little cable, we're going to wrap it around, and we're going to attach it to one of these beams. Now that's rock solid, but if something happened and that fell, if you look down here, there's nothing stopping anything from falling. Now we're perfectly safe behind this railing, But if you drop something small, like a quarter or a piece of change, it could potentially kill somebody. So you can't just think about our gear being safe. We have to think about the people down there, just in case anything happens. So this is fairly typical for Dubai. I mean, it really does require sometimes some funny gear to have with you and a little bit of cleverness and creativity, but above all else, safety as well. Clouds kind of dissipated a little bit, but we're getting to the point where the sun's setting and they're starting to turn colors. So I'm going to go ahead and initiate a pano here. Remember, this is completely manual. I have to do this. Generally, when you're shooting panoramic photography, a good rule of thumb when you're overlapping your frames is to overlap by around 1/3 of the image. Now, that's pretty easy to tell because you have all these tall buildings, so these buildings will start to fall into 1/3 of your frame. Once you get a reading for that, if you don't want to look through the camera, and it gets very difficult because as the camera rotates far away, I can't see the back of the camera anymore. But what I can do is I can use my degrees of rotation here. So this is all indicated here as degrees. So if I turn this actually from here to here, that's actually a 30-degree rotation. So I've basically turned this from side to side, and what I've calculated is that 15 degrees seems to be an even 1/3 overlap. So what I can do is start at the farthest extent of my pano, which is going to be all the way over here towards Business Bay. And I'm putting that indication line here right at 60 degrees, and at 45 degrees here you can see there's another indicator says that's at 330. So once I have that set up, I can go ahead and make sure if I move it, first thing I want to do is make sure that it has time to settle. If I quickly move this and let go, it'll jolt a little bit, and even if you look at the back of the camera, you can see that it has to settle because this isn't completely stable. I want to make sure I give myself at least a second between when I let go and when I shoot. So we'll start here. This is as far as I'm going to go to the right. As soon as it settles, I'm just going to press the trigger here. It's going to shoot 3 exposure brackets and set to manual focus mode, so my focus is not going to change between frames. What I'll do is I'll rotate it 15 degrees, wait a moment, and shoot. 15 more degrees, wait a moment, and shoot again. And I'm just going to repeat this for the entire extent of my pano. Right now it's not quite blue hour, but we can start to see some of the lights coming on in the city. The most important thing though, these little wispy clouds are starting to get nice little shades of pink, and we have a little purple on the horizon. So I'm trying to capture that last bit of light in the sky. Now, I anticipate this will get a little bit better as it goes into blue hour, but this is one of those situations where I can't automate this process, so shooting one panoramic image takes me quite a few minutes just to run through the process. So I have to make sure that I continuously shoot so that I can capture the best stage of light. So at this point, I'm rotating again around 15 degrees. I actually like to have everything start from one side to the end, and then when I initiate a new pano, I like to go all the way back to the other side and start again. The reason being, when I bring this into Lightroom, I'm going to have panel from right to left, right, all the way to left, and then in Lightroom you'll see one shoot all the way back over to the right, all the way to the left. Makes it easier to select them, build previews out of them, so I know inside of Lightroom that group is a separate pano. If I go right to left and then immediately left to right, inside of Lightroom it's going to ping pong back and forth. Sometimes it's hard to tell which set goes with the other set. And since the light changes, I want it to be consistent as possible as I start to stitch those frames. Talking about these settings a little bit, with this setup and 0 parallax, I'm actually able to shoot as wide as my lens will allow. In this case, 10mm on APS-C, which is the equivalent of 16mm if we're talking about the full frame sensor. Now, I have it zoomed in a little bit to the equivalent of about 16 on this lens just so that I can focus in on the Burj Khalifa. Now, this is going to be an ultra-wide pano, and my thought is if I focus in a little bit and push in, I'm going to have more emphasis on the Burj itself. If I zoom all the way out, there's great stuff here in the foreground, but believe it or not, that tall building, the tallest building in the world, actually becomes so far away that it becomes insignificant. So again, I want to make sure that it's still the main focus of this panoramic image. My settings themselves as I go around, I'm leaving this in aperture priority mode and I'm shooting at f8. Now, another way that you can do panos if you guys feel more comfortable with it is setting it to manual mode and getting a reading. The difficulty is I'm actually going back and forth. I'm shooting a pano, I'm shooting all my tiles, going back like a typewriter, resetting, shooting again, shooting again, shooting again. So if I was shooting in manual mode, that means that each time I'd have to balance the exposure to shoot in manual. With these cameras and the meters today, It's really easy to do this in aperture priority mode. You won't have that much difference as you get from the right side to the left side. And in Lightroom, or any other Pano program that we're going to be processing RAWs, we have the ability to manipulate the RAW files before we stitch everything together. So if there are any discrepancies between the lighting, between frames, it's really easy to adjust in post-processing before we stitch the Panos themselves. Speaking about post-processing, we're going to be covering different ways to stitch these Panos later on. Starting to get pretty dark out here, so I'm going to wrap this up by shooting probably 2 or 3 more Panos. The next time I see you guys, we'll take a look at all of these in post-processing, we'll build the previews, and we'll work on different ways to stitch these Panos together seamlessly. Welcome back to the post-processing studio, everybody. I'm really excited about this lesson because this is the first time we're going to be stitching together a panoramic image, and the location was phenomenal. And as you saw while we were in the field, it was also a little bit tricky, and I've come to accept that a lot of the best locations in Dubai and in cities all over the world happen to be those really tricky, precarious situations. That's why I always have clamps and tabletop tripods and different things I can use to make sure that I can get the shot. Because often it's not just a balcony like it was in the Index Tower. Very often it's this weird rooftop with all these crazy angles and obstructions and things to get in your way. So it just kind of goes to show you that it's always good to be prepared. And with this lesson in particular, I really wanted to show you guys how you can get the best out of shooting cities like Dubai with a minimal amount of gear. And a few years ago, I wouldn't have thought it was possible to use such a small clamp, like that Really Right Stuff clamp that I was using, along with the PGO1, which is a small gimbal, and still get these phenomenal sharp images. So it's really cool. Where I couldn't actually use a tripod, I was able to use something simple instead and still get the shot. So let's go ahead and take a look inside of Lightroom. Now, as you can see here in Lightroom, this is a lot of panels that I shot, and I just went ahead and selected the one that has the Burj right in the middle. I always try to have at least one, especially with the Burj Khalifa. I mean, it is the tallest building in the world, so it's also the most important building in post-processing to make sure that it's straight. So as long as you have one panel where it's in the center, you know it's not going to be distorted at all. But as I sort of breeze through these, and if I select it here and just kind of go through, we can actually start all the way here on the side and go all the way here to the left. It's actually going to be a really big panoramic image. Now, it's also interesting, I've selected this one not because it was my favorite blue hour, but it was actually because, full disclosure, right before we had to leave. So we were really lucky to gain access to this tower, but we had some pretty strict restrictions on the amount of time that we could stay up there. So this was the last panoramic image I was able to shoot before we had to call it a night. Thankfully, the color and the reflection still looks really good, and it's going to give us enough to work with. I still, out of habit, would have liked to stay a little bit longer, but that being said, we're going to do our best to make this into the perfect blue hour. So let's go ahead and take a look at the image itself. Now we're going to have to do a few things. Now remember, we're going to be stitching this into a panorama here in Lightroom. I'm going to walk you guys through that. Before that, if I were to go through the basic steps, it would be a little bit of noise reduction. And in this case, I think the highlights are just a little bit too hot. So we might want to pull that down just a little bit. Also the whites, let's go ahead and make it an even quarter stop. And the shadows, maybe we'll just pull up just a little bit, about 15%. With that, we're just going to go ahead, and it's quicker here to just copy the settings, and in this case, noise reduction and basic tone. Hopefully we don't have to do any distortion reduction, because that would not be good. The whole reason we used the gimbal was so that we didn't have to have any distortion to remove. So let's go ahead and paste these settings. Really quick, really easy settings. Now, inside of Lightroom, it's really easy. Now, when you're stitching panoramic images, this is a great feature because now it allows you to just take the raw files themselves, go up to the photo option, and photo merge. Now, something to point out before I do that, it's going to take all of these RAF files. After we process the panoramic image, it's actually going to create another raw file in DNG format. DNG is the universal format for RAW that a lot of cameras use. It was created by Adobe. So it's basically going to take as much of the information from these RAW files that it can read, and then it's going to create the panorama, and it's going to create another RAW file out of that. Now you might be wondering, is that raw DNG file as powerful as the RAWs from the camera? Well, the answer is, I'm really not sure, but I don't think so. I do not believe that when you take these RAW files and create a panoramic image and it turns it into a DNG, that it is literally the sum of all of its original parts. That being said, it's much more powerful than, let's say, a TIFF or a PSD. So is it a powerful RAW file? Yes, it is. Is it as good as the original ones? I'm not quite sure, but it's pretty close. So in order to create a Pano, and now that we understand that it's going to be a DNG, we select all of these, go up to Photo, Photo Merge, Panorama. After some quick processing, you'll see that it's going to build the panorama, and right now it's showing me a low resolution preview. If I wait a little bit longer, that should pop into high res. But before, let me go ahead and talk about the few options we have. Now we really only have a couple projection options. The default is spherical, cylindrical, and perspective. I can tell you perspective's not going to work, but you do have a choice sometimes between spherical and cylindrical. So if I select cylindrical, you can see it will probably, yep, it's going to stretch this out just a little bit more. But it actually feels like it's stretching out the Burj Khalifa, so I'm going to go based on the default spherical. Now, there are a couple more options. There's auto crop, and you can see that that's going to crop the panorama itself. But for cityscape photography, there's this great feature called boundary warp. Now watch what happens when I roll this to the right. It's actually going to take that and bring that into the corner. Now notice how the Burj Khalifa is a little offset. That means my horizon did move. It did sag just a little bit. But if I move this boundary warp all the way to the right, you can see that everything pops up and is vertical. Now once I click merge, it will go ahead and take this preview and apply it and create a final produced panoramic image. Let's click merge. So as you can see, unlike the preview, this is extremely high resolution, and it's stitched together seemingly perfect, and it's a huge panoramic image. You can also see that it has mirrored my settings. So anything that I have selected pre-conversion to panoramic, it should have applied to the post DNG file. So now in Lightroom, it's up to you whether you want to make your adjustments first or you want to make the adjustments after. It looks like it just applies them directly to the stitched result. But now that this is a panorama, let's just talk about the composition. Now, it is really impressive. The one here around Business Bay, this looks really nice, but you can see I'm actually getting part of the building structure over here. So I'm going to have to either clone all that out, which I really don't want to do, or crop it. But in this case, if we go to the cropping, now I know previously I've been doing all my cropping after Photoshop, but since this is such a big file, I actually just want to do some cropping now. If I were to just crop that building out, let's take a look. Now that looks pretty good, but with the Burj Khalifa being the tallest building in the world, we can either offset that composition or we can keep it in the center. Now in this case, we have a couple things going on. We have leading lines here in the road, we have a beautiful leading line here, and the circle, what they call the ring of Dubai, and we also have this river. But what I want to do is actually center the Burj Khalifa. So if I were to move this over and actually center the Burj, what does that look like? Well, it actually looks pretty nice. Compositionally, it looks really even with the leading lines. The only thing I want to point out is this little light down here. I probably don't want to crop any of that out. So I'm just going to go a little bit past it so it's almost dead center. Let's take a look. And I really do like that composition. I can probably crop just a little bit more off. Perfect. So let's make some more adjustments. First thing, let's add some deep contrast here with the dehaze. So I'll slide all the way down here and we'll add some contrast there. And that's going to pick it up, make it seem like it's a little bit later at night for the blue hour. Let's just make that an even 20. We'll go up here after we do that. And let's create a gradient just for the sky. We'll reset the settings we had before, and what I actually want to do is adjust the color of this. So let's see, let's make that a little cooler first. I'm going to create sort of a darker blue hour, and let's actually go ahead and tint it a little bit too, just to remove the cyan. So let's do something like that, like 15 and 10, and that's going to make it a little bit more of a dramatic, darker blue, seemingly more of a darker blue hour. And just to pull that out a little bit more, if I start to pull the highlights down, you can see that I'm also pulling the highlights down in the Burj because it actually has the sunlight hitting it, and I'm also darkening up the sky a little bit more. So it's giving it the illusion that it's a little bit darker and a little bit later at night. While we're at it, let's go ahead and create another gradient just here, just on the bottom, because I feel like these dark areas here are just a little bit too dark. So we'll just go ahead and not modify the highlights at all, not modify the temperature, but I can actually bring the blacks up just a little bit. Just 7 or 8. Perfect. Let's close this out, double check the crop, make sure everything's good, because the next step is to export this into Photoshop the same way we've been exporting every other file. The only difference is this file is much larger. That's actually why I'm doing the cropping now, pre-cropping before Photoshop, because the file size will get a little out of control otherwise. So I'll right-click this, export with previous. Now that we're inside of Photoshop, let's just check something. Let's go to image size, and let's see, this is 15,000 pixels by 5,500. So that's actually a fairly large image at 300 dpi. Let's actually go to inches. So right now this is basically 51 by 18, so basically 50 by 20. Now that's a pretty big image. So the whole Pano, the width is probably something around 60 inches as the final result. So that's a very high megapixel result. So you have to bear that in mind when you're working in Photoshop on panoramic images or any high resolution imagery. We've been working at 24 megapixels so far. These file sizes are going to get much more difficult to manage and much larger. So just something to keep in mind. Definitely keep saving in the background just in case something happens with Photoshop. So right off the bat, let's just go ahead and take a look at this. It looks nice. Let's just go ahead and pan through. Make sure everything's stitched together properly. And what I'm looking at are buildings for one, and also just some of the details, like anything in the road, any little choppy elements basically. And here I don't really see any. Even this building, it unwrapped perfectly. The river here, everything looks great. But if I scroll up here to the sky, notice that repetitive dark spot? Well, that single spot, that single little spot on my lens or the spot on my sensor translates basically into a spot in every single panel that was stitched together. So what we have to do is not just one spot removal, but we'll have to go in and with the heel brush here, we're just going to have to go in and get rid of every single one of those really quickly. It's pretty easy. Now, the sky is not fantastic. It's blue. You guys know I really like clouds, so we'll address that here shortly. But the first thing we have to do is clean it up. And basically every single panel that stitches together, expect to have one of these little spots. One and one more, and that should take care of it. While I'm at it, let's go ahead and zoom in. Let's take a look at either what is a star, which is a little bit difficult in Dubai to see, a hot pixel, which is more likely, or a passing airplane, which is even more likely than a hot pixel. Same thing here. A couple things on the horizon. Let's just go ahead and get rid of them. That's definitely an airplane coming into the airport. If I pan over a little bit more, that all actually looks pretty good. Let's just do one more sweep to make sure that I got everything. Looks pretty clean to me. I have to admit, I really like this Pano. The composition, the symmetry of the leading lines from the left, the river on the right, the Ring of Dubai, the beautiful light on the Burj Khalifa is not something that happens all year. It really only happens in the wintertime and when it's clear like this. So you kind of have to have a clear sky to get that golden light illuminating and radiating off the Burj Khalifa itself. But saying that, this sky, it has some texture. Here, some clouds, here there's some clouds, and beautiful sort of horizon, dusty, but lightly dusty Dubai horizon. Now, for me, you guys know I really like skies, I really like drama in the skies, and since this is photographing the world, we're going to have to do something about this sky. Now, a lot of the times I do have time to go back and reshoot different situations, but in Dubai, like I said, I was really fortunate to gain access to this tower. I don't know if I went back if I'd be able to get up in this tower again. So instead of going back and reshooting it, which is an amazing luxury to be able to do, let's just go ahead and replace the sky. Now, this is a panoramic image, so it's really wide. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm just going to bring in a random sky that I've shot. And I've actually shot this sky here. And if you go into the Lesson 10 Dubai Vision Tower Pano, you'll see in the PSD files folder, you'll see a sky replacement.jpg. You bring that into Photoshop, you can see that this is basically just soft texture. So this is a horizon somewhere in the southwest of the United States that I just shot handheld, actually using the Fujifilm GFX 50S, which is a 50 megapixel camera. So I know that this is going to be pretty good resolution for the Pano. The other thing that makes this image unique, now this is not a fantastic sky, right? Like it's just streaky texture. But if we were to stretch this, would you really notice? If we were to use pieces of this, all this really is just sort of a misty, streaky, cloudy sky. So I think it's going to work really well for our scene. So first things first, let's go ahead and select it. We'll copy it, and we're actually just going to bring it in right on top. And I'll paste it. Now, this is coming from a different source. So the source was Adobe RGB working sRGB Destination Pro Photo. That's fine. We'll just go ahead and click OK. And if you don't ever want to see this dialog window again, you can always just click Don't Show Again. All right, so this is actually almost the size of the panoramic image. The first thing is, let's go ahead and stretch it. So I'm just going to go ahead and Command T. So I'm going to hold Option, and that will apply this to both sides evenly. Stretch it all the way across, hit Enter to apply. All right, that about wraps it up. No, I'm just kidding. We have a lot more to do. First things first, if I change the opacity, you can kind of see what's underneath. As I've explained, when we're replacing skies, the best thing that you can do is resolve this into some sort of blending mode. The reason why is if we use something like overlay, for example, on the sky, and let's just go ahead and move this up. Now you can see that this is a dramatic result. This is not exactly what I want as the final result. But what you can see is instead of having to hard mask around these edges, drop in a new sky, if we mess with the opacity here, we could actually just add texture to that sky. And you can see that it's adding the blending mode over the Burj Khalifa and over these buildings. But unlike the normal blending mode like this, it's not blocking them out completely. So in this case, we're going to use the overlay blending mode, and we're going to start working with that. We're going to have to do a little bit of masking here. So the first thing I want to do is just go ahead and put this in a folder. And we're going to name this New Sky. We're going to call this Sky Replacement. And we'll go ahead and name our stitched pano and our sky spot removal. And I'll go ahead and save this in the background as well. So first thing here with the new sky, let me go ahead and start. I like the opacity around 60%. I feel like the sky looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and add a mask to this directly. Go to the gradient tool. I'm going to set this to normal because it was in multiply for the previous lesson. And I'm just going to go ahead and fade this out from here to about here. So you can see that sky is looking pretty cool. So I might want to adjust this mask a little bit. But for now, you can see that I'm really trying to just get that in the sky. I want to see how I want that sky to look, or at least the start of how that sky should look. Once I do that, the next thing I'm going to do is kind of adjust this gradient itself. So I could redraw it, or I can unlink it, and now I can move this sky. You can see I can move the sky up and down if I want a little bit of that color on the horizon, or if I just want it to go below the horizon here, I can decide. And I can also, with Command T, since that's unlinked, I can change the gradient itself. So you can see now, since that's a dusty horizon, you can see if I went hard on the horizon there, you can see that it doesn't look realistic. But if I soften that up, and I soften that gradation between the sky and the background, you can see I can use the dust, the natural dust from the environment to sort of fade into those clouds themselves. And that's starting to look pretty good. So I can create sort of a soft selection into the sky, and I'll go ahead and apply that. Now here's something that we're noticing, and this is going to be a problem. If I turn this off, This is almost a blue sky. And when I toggle it on, you can see that because it's almost a blue sky, there's a few clouds. And when I overlay, you can see that these white clouds are sort of mixing in with the sky replacement. So I kind of always say this, if you want to replace the sky, it's easiest when it's completely blue because it's basically just a blue clean palette for you to work with. Sometimes there's little wispy clouds that you have to take care of. And when you do any blending modes, you can see that these wispy clouds, if I zoom in here, you can see that they mess up with this overlay function. So the overlay on top of that, it doesn't blend with the cloud, it actually makes it look like a mistake. So we're going to have to zap that out. So that means that we're actually going to have to remove these clouds and these clouds. So in addition to the sky spot removal, next thing we're going to have to do is a cloud removal. So let me go ahead and create a new layer and we'll call this cloud removal. First thing I want to try is I want to try the heal brush again. Let's see what happens if I just paint over this cloud. Looks pretty good. I have a little bit of cleanup here, a little bit more cleanup, but it looks like it's going to take care of it on this side. Now I'm not going to concern myself with the hazy horizon, mostly just going to concern myself with these clouds themselves. Now again, I'm getting somewhat of a hard edge, and if I do end up with a hard edge there, what I'm also going to do is just with the clone stamp, I'm just going to soften that edge up a little bit just by moving over here and painting that in. So remember, this is not our final sky. We just have to make sure that we blend this over top, that there's nothing sticking out. There's no other clouds. So here too, this looks pretty good. And again, it doesn't have to be perfect. We're going to cover it up. Let's see if we get lucky here and we can do a content-aware fill of these clouds. Not bad, but not great either. Let's see if we can do that one more time. See if it picks up the surrounding blue. Pretty good. Probably go in here as well with a clone stamp and just kind of clean that up. Remember, it just has to be close. And if you want to see what it looks like, it actually looks better than it did before. So now we have to adjust these clouds. Now, that's a lot of cloud to get rid of. So for example, if I go back here and I try to get rid of a lot of this, you can see that it's probably going to have problems when I try to remove that much of the image. Yeah, that looks really bad. So let's do something a little bit different. Rather than painting this in, let's say, you know what, this side of the sky looks really good, this side of the sky needs some work, but we want that flat blue. The other thing is you can see that this color is having a slight effect on the sky replacement itself, while this side looks pretty good. So let's turn that off again. And what I'm actually going to do is with this layer selected, I'm going to hold Shift, Option, Command, E, and I'm going to create a new clean layer. And the reason I'm going to create a new clean layer is I'm going to grab a marquee selection just past the Burj itself and to the edge of this above the building, just like that. And what I'm going to do is hold Command and press J and create a new layer. And that new layer is just going to be that piece of the sky. So I'll go ahead and turn this off for now, and we'll call this Sky Patch. Now, since the sky is pretty much uniform on one side here, and I think I can use it on this other side, I'm going to press Command-T and transform this, and I'm actually just going to transform the sky over top, just like this. And as I do that, I'm also going to move it over. So I'll hit Enter here, and I'll move it over as well. And I'll hold Shift, just like that. All right, so that's looking pretty good. You can see that edge there on the right. That looks actually pretty good. Now notice that I have an edge here, but for the most part the skies match. With the sky patch selected, what I'm going to do is something really easy. I'm just going to create a mask and select the gradient, and I'll make sure the mask is selected. It should be white to black, and I'm going to fade this off from about here to here. So you can see that that now will fade that color right into itself. Now changing the mode to multiply, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to fade this from about here to the edge here. And you can see that now I have a patch for the sky that looks pretty good, and it still maintains this little area. So with the sky patch, I can go ahead and get rid of this layer. And let's go ahead and turn that sky replacement on one more time. That's looking much better. So now that I've adjusted the sky, I've gotten rid of anything in the sky that's going to change the sky replacement, let's go ahead and make some adjustments to it. First thing I'm going to do is scale the original sky. I make sure I don't really want any of that from the bottom. I actually just want some of this nice blue, and I want this area to feel like it's just haze. So that looks pretty good, and I'll go ahead and apply that with Enter. Same thing here with the gradient. Let's go ahead and transform that gradient so it fades off a little bit more. And you can see as I do that, it's going to fade that sky in, just add a little bit of texture. And that looks pretty good. I'll go ahead and toggle that on and off. And let's go ahead and change the opacity a little bit. We'll bring it up just a little bit more. Something around 75%. So now let's really take a look at this. If I zoom in, you can see that we have a nice soft fade. So we even get a little bit of color down here in the dust, just like the dust is mixing into that sky. Now, where I am getting problems, though, is where that sky starts to intersect actual geometry. Here, it's not such a big deal. On the Amar Tower here, you can see I'm getting some color on the side of the white. But here on the Burj Khalifa, however, it is actually changing the color. So you can see while it's modifying the color, it's not changing it too dramatically, but it is making a change. So for example, here on this tower, if I would leave it, do you think anybody would notice that small color variation? Probably not, but definitely on the Burj Khalifa itself. So what we're going to need to do, on the master folder for this, I'm going to create a new mask, and what I'm going to do is actually just mask out the Burj Khalifa itself. So I'll go ahead and zoom in. And what I'm actually going to do is with the lasso tool here, we'll just go ahead and select, and I'll start here. With the lasso tool selected, you can see I'm making a nice design here. If I hold Option, I'll actually bind it to the linear tool here, and I'll just go ahead and make selections here. Now what I like to do sometimes, rather than just selecting the entire object, is I'll select little pieces at a time. So here, for example, I have a selection that I've created. And I can add to that selection just by holding Shift. So I can pan up a little bit to the next part, go back to the lasso tool, and I can shift. And then with Shift, I can switch to the Option key, and when I let go, it'll bind it to the linear lasso again. So here I can just go ahead and take advantage of one of these straight linear lines here, and I can add a little bit more at a time. So piece by piece, rather than tracing the whole object, I can actually just edit piece by piece, bit by bit. Pan up a little bit like this, hold Shift, press Option, hold Option, and we can go ahead and mask out the Burj Khalifa. So we've masked the Burj Khalifa. So we've masked the Burj a few times now. Thankfully, this is a really easy one to mask out. There's not too much going on. The other thing is this is color. Since we used a blending mode, this is mostly just color, so it's pretty easy to deal with. So with this selected, I'll go ahead and fill with black. Now we know from previous lessons, if I hold Command Delete, the background color is what will fill. If I press Shift Delete, if you're never sure, you can always select contents, foreground or background color before you say OK. And that's just going to black that out. So you can see if I Command D to deselect, I've missed a little bit of that. You can see that edge. That's not that big of a deal. I can actually go to this mask to the properties and feather it by 1 pixel and soften it out. So at this point, we just have to go through and figure out if any of it needs to be cleaned out. Same thing in a similar way. If I want to go ahead and be a perfectionist, I could go and do the same thing here to just remove it. Doesn't have to be perfect because this is less dramatic, but if I just go ahead and mask that out, you can see that it will bring some of that back. And what I need to do is just go ahead and toggle this on and off and determine whether or not I need to make adjustments to these building tops. The most important one being the Burj Khalifa, and you can see that now that sky is not affecting the Burj. But anywhere that it is sort of, well, let's say intersecting it or covering it up, it's going to be doing it with a blending mode rather than a hard edge, so it's going to be a little bit better. Now from here, it's all about the adjustments. It's all about how much of this you want to bring in, how much you want to mask out, where exactly you want this mask to be, if you want it to slide up a little bit more, slide down a little bit more. That's just going to be up to you. The other thing is you can always position this if you want to get a little bit more ambitious and try to add some of that red into the sky. A little bit more difficult to do, but you have complete control over the placement of this sky. And then the other thing we have control over is the overall opacity. Do we want this to be really intense, or do we want it to be pretty soft? I think somewhere between 60 and 75 is pretty good for this image. And with everything selected, I'm not going to go into the camera raw filter. That could be the next step if you choose to. What I'm actually going to do to keep this file smaller, now if I go into the camera raw filter, it's going to duplicate the layer and double the file size. Now I can tell you just with these few things, if we look down at the bottom, the open size of this file is already over 1.5 gigs because it's so large. Every time I duplicate this, every time I go into the camera raw filter, it's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. So what I'm going to do is use channels and selections instead. So let's go ahead and create a midtones mask. So we have the highlights here, so let's call this highlights. Let's call that highs. I'll invert it, create a new mask, and call this shadows. We'll select all and drop both selections. Whoops, go back to the layers here, create a new curves. So all I really wanted to do was add contrast. I want to unify these things together. So I'm going to do that just by pulling this down, so that's going to grab the mid-tone contrast. I'm also going to bring the highlights up a little bit, and that's going to intensify that sky. So it's going to give us a really nice, dramatic sort of result. You can toggle this on and off, and you can see it's pulling all those details back out. That's actually looking really nice. It's a beautiful panoramic image. So the next thing I want to do is just go ahead and add a high-pass filter, and I can do that by duplicating the stitched pano or just going Shift-Option-Command-E, create a new layer of everything on top, going up to Filter, Other, High Pass. I'm going to use a radius of 3, set this to Overlay, create a new mask, use the Gradient tool, and we're just going to have that fade right into the sky itself. I just want to take a look because we have to zoom in to get all this detail. We have before and after, and that high pass filter should chisel out all of these amazing details in the buildings themselves. That looks pretty good. Now it's time to wrap up this lesson. Let's go ahead and recap by going to Lightroom first. Now we have taken 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18 panels, 18 single exposures, and we have merged them into a seamless panorama. We cropped it a little bit, brought it into Photoshop, and turned it into this. So we decided that right out of the box, straight out of camera, it looked really nice, but we had to first fix the sky spots. We got rid of those spots, and then we actually wanted to bring in a sky replacement. So very quickly, we took the stitched pano from Lightroom, which was here, and then after some minor adjustments and a complete sky replacement, we went from here to here. That wraps things up here in the studio for the Vision Tower Pano. Next time I see you guys, we're going to be in a very public access point at the Shangri-La Hotel, and what I think is one of the most beautiful views of Dubai itself.